Reverend Mary Catherine Robinson, the pastor of Black Mountain Presbyterian Church, was surrounded by a crowd of people who had found their way to her church grounds in late September of 2024 after Hurricane Helene wreaked havoc on western North Carolina. As you know, homes and businesses were destroyed, parts of the road were missing, many roads were missing. There was no water, power, or cell phone service. People were scared, and many people seeking help found their way into this church's parking lot. Church members started emptying the church pantry and cooking everything they found in the freezer on gas stoves. And Reverend Robinson was walking around in the middle of the crowd with a pad of paper in her hand, writing down the needs that people had, like water, blankets, gas, formula. Her face reflected her shock as the enormity of the damage was becoming clear, story by story. One of Reverend Robinson's staff members walked up to her, gasping at the sight of all of this, and exclaimed, "What is going on? How are we going to wash all these dishes?" And Reverend Robinson walked by a trash can, looked inside of it, and just shrugged and said, "Well, there's some rainwater in here with just a few French fries floating in it." I imagine Reverend Robinson's staff questioning whether this pastor had lost her mind. Washing dishes with rainwater from a trash can? This whole situation feels impossible, and I can imagine some of them were thinking, "Okay, lady, that's enough. We need to send people away. We've done all we can, and this is way too much." Jesus' disciples were feeling the very same way. In the story from Mark's gospel, it had been enough already. There had been so many people coming and going that the disciples didn't even have a chance to eat. Jesus had invited them to a deserted place to rest a while. And as their boat landed on the shore, they were so close to being able to retreat. And yet as soon as they stepped out, a great crowd swarmed around them. The disciples didn't have anything left to give, but Jesus had compassion on the people and began to teach them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. The disciples stuck it out, but when the dinner hour came, they were ready to close up shop. Send them away so they can buy themselves something to eat. This seems very reasonable, right? The disciples are overwhelmed, they're ready for a break, and they had already been sidetracked enough. But Jesus says to them, "You give them something to eat." They're tired and spent and slam out of resources, and they respond to Jesus, "Are you out of your mind? Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? We don't have that kind of money. This is about 3/4 of our annual salary, don't you know?" And then Jesus instructs them to just go and see what they have, to take stock of the resources among the people. Jesus doesn't start with the problem. Jesus starts with telling them to look around and see what they do have. The disciples come back and report, "We have 5 loaves and 2 fish. So he sends them out again, and this time he tells them to have the people sit down in groups and face one another. And Jesus takes the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looks up to heaven, blesses and breaks the loaves, and then gives them to his disciples to set before the people. And something amazing happens. While they are sitting there facing one another, the loaves and the fish are set out before them, and all ate and were filled. All 5,000 men, yes, which implies their families were also there. So all 5,000 men and their wives and their children and their families ate and were filled. There is enough. There's more than enough. There are even 12 baskets of leftovers. Jesus draws them into communal care. And what had seemed impossible becomes possible in community together. One theologian emphasizes how important this instruction of having the people face one another becomes, and suggests that this moment transforms the people from a crowd to a community. He says, without diminishing the miracle, notice how fundamentally this move alters the dynamic of the narrative. You can visualize the significance of the transformation. I picture a supply truck arriving in a refugee camp, the hungry crowd gathering as a frenzied pack to get their share of the scarce resources before they quickly disappear. In community, the dynamics are altogether different. Sitting in a circle, you connect with those around you. And as you pass the bread from person to person, aware of how many people it has to feed, you're less likely to take more than your share. Both because you can see the faces of those around you and because the collective will of the group will not allow anything else. You can imagine that those who might have had a little extra tucked away, afraid to share with the hungry crowd, now are more willing to add theirs to the collective pot, knowing that there will be enough for them too. Walter Brueggemann was the first one to describe these differences in perspective as the myth of scarcity versus the liturgy of abundance. The disciples are caught up in the myth of scarcity. They're responding out of exhaustion because they feel like they have to rely on themselves to address the need. And they're really not certain they can handle anymore. They don't believe there's enough. They think they are the only ones who have resources, and they're fresh out of those. And their solution is to send the crowd away, encouraging each of them to fend for themselves with their own economic assets. But when Jesus pushes them towards one another, they find themselves in relationship. Yes, their leadership is still important, but when they help everyone turn towards each other, they find resources they didn't know they had. And Jesus blesses those resources. And then what they have becomes more than enough, and they have an overflowing abundance. Adam Wilson found an abandoned working farm on the real estate market in upstate New York. A friend of his had come into an inheritance and gave Wilson the gift of $500,000 to purchase this farm. But the only stipulation was that he had to use it to feed his neighbors for free. Wilson points out how it was just a few generations ago that people sustained themselves on local farms, but now that we participate in a consumer economy, we are more focused on filling the world with solar panels, he said, instead of learning something from how people lived before. And he believes that we've forgotten the value of restraint. Wilson hopes that we can learn to see ourselves more as neighbors, not consumers, and participate in the practice of what he calls neighboring, which is developing the capacity to sustain others. On his gift-based, non-market community farm, Wilson hosts Gratitude Feast once a month where he gathers neighbors for conversation and a meal. Wilson said from the very beginning, he knew the food would not be served from a buffet line. He admits that every time he goes through a line, he piles on food as the setup makes him afraid that there won't be enough if he wants to go back for seconds. So Wilson decided they would serve the meal family style, where everyone sits in a circle facing one another. You can see how much food is there and how many people need to eat. And he says, simply changing our relationship to the food awakens a capacity for village-mindedness, a capacity to imagine the whole before we serve ourselves. And it's not a hardship for people to share with one another. It's actually quite joyful and meaningful, and perhaps a whole lot less lonely. It's hard not to get overwhelmed by all the needs in our world and in our community. How could we possibly tell one another anything good in this season? Our educational and mental health systems are failing us and our children. People are strapped by housing they cannot afford and healthcare bills that have gotten out of control. Some children in our town don't have enough food to eat or a place to lay their head at night. The cost of living is rising, but salaries are not rising at the same rate. And since 2020, the food prices have gone up by 29%. And people who rely upon assistance are feeling this the most. Climate change continues to have devastating impact on communities. Immigrants are being treated as less than human in our country, and the United States, alongside Israel, has launched massive airstrikes against Iran. And this past week, the United States launched a military operation in Ecuador, in case you missed that. We continue to choose violence, which we know only begets more violence. It feels like too much. And sometimes I know I want to scream, enough already. Do you? I imagine we all want to go away to a deserted place like the disciples and rest a while. Sabbath rest is a necessary spiritual practice. We are finite and we can't do everything. We are not God. But that is precisely the problem. Sometimes we act as if we are God. We often want to run away because we think everything depends upon us. And like Jesus' disciples, we need to examine how we view the world and what we are called to do as Jesus' disciples. What story has captivated us? Are we discouraged because we think that there really isn't enough for everyone? Do we think that all of our resources are dried up? Do we think that it all depends upon us? Are we cynical because we believe that what Jesus wants for the world is impractical, unreasonable, and impossible? And do we think that things are too far gone for healing to even be possible? Do we think that there's nothing good to share? If the answer to some of these questions is yes, then we may need to step back and examine the story that we are telling ourselves. The world often says that life is about your attitude, that you can decide whether you see your cup as half empty or half full. Are you a half empty person or are you a half full kind of person? But as Christians, our cups are neither half empty or half full. Even when it feels like our cups have run dry, our cups are actually overflowing. When we turn to God and to one another, we will find that our cups are not just full, but overflowing with joy, goodness, abundance, generosity, love, and compassion. And we can stop looking inside of ourselves and thinking our gifts are all that we have. We can sit in a circle with our community and look again for resources we didn't know we had. We can stop worrying about being self-made, self-sufficient, reasonable, and efficient, and we can depend upon God's abundance to meet the needs of our world. We can stop trying to create limits and boundaries that don't exist, no longer being deceived by the myth of scarcity, and instead we can live compelled by the vision of God's abundance. We can stop letting sound economics have the last word, and we can start truly believing in the economy of God, where somehow 5 loaves and 2 fish are enough for everyone, where somehow what we thought was impossible is possible together. I preached a sermon on this text exactly 10 years ago, and I reread it this past week. And it reminded me that in 2015, we were celebrating ways that we had moved into ministries that were more abundant and more impactful. Block parties in the Wren Drive community and friends we met at Vacation Bible School had led us into developing a summer program with the Kirk of Kildare and a backpack buddy ministry, both of which continue to help feed children in our community today and empower those folks to use their gifts as well. We were celebrating our youth who were learning a different way to engage in mission work. They had immersed themselves in a ministry based on an asset-based community development model and had learned that we have just as much to receive as we have to give. And we were celebrating that Carrie, A town that had blocked homeless shelters for many decades was working with nonprofits and churches and town leaders to build a shelter for women and children. And we were talking about the possibility of hosting that shelter here on our campus. And having the gift of being able to look back over a decade, I'm able to tell you something good. That when we turned toward one another, we were able to do things that we once thought impossible. However, as you know, that shelter was never built. The nonprofit partner that was going to develop it realized after doing more research and talking more to the community, it was not the best way to use their resources. And furthermore, people who were struggling, they actually talked to them, wanted help staying in their neighborhoods instead of help acquiring a bed at a shelter. But that dead end eventually led us to another vision, an affordable housing, an affordable childcare center right here on our property. And now, as the dream of the Timothy Ash Carr Center is coming closer to being born, I found myself sharing about it at a One Wake meeting this past week. And I went into the meeting feeling exhausted by it all, quite frankly, because it has become a lot. And sometimes I joke that as a pastor with a liberal arts degrees, they're all liberal arts degrees, is getting schooled in engineering and architecture and development and construction all at once. And as we get closer to the demolition of our building, which is set to occur in January of 2027, I'm feeling the pressure of securing the rest of the money through grants, foundations, and donors for the Child Care Center condo, which is our portion of it. Reverend Dr. Rose Cornelius, who you know, was actually one of the leaders of that nonprofit that was going to build the women's shelter over 10 years ago. And she was in the room when I was doing this presentation on Wednesday, and she spoke up and she said, "Lauren, hold on. I want to point out that every time our community has come together to discuss a need, and we've looked at our resources together, your church has been the first one to step up every time." Back in 2015, when we were talking about a shelter, she said, and then recently when we started talking about the need for affordable housing, Greenwood Forest stood up again. "Thank you," she said. The room erupted in applause after she said that. And in that moment, I felt grateful for all of you. And I also was reminded that I'm not alone when I'm up at night worrying about how we're going to raise that money. And it's not all up to me. And I really actually don't have to figure it all out alone. After I shared, Mary Kentz from St. Paul's Episcopal Church shared their story as a church about how they became partners with us in this project. And as they came into money from their diocese, they had to decide how to distribute it. St. Paul's is a sister church here in Cary and a community partner with One Wake, and Mary said it was an easy decision for her church. She and others had gotten to know people at Greenwood Forest. She's like, "We've sat beside you in town council meetings as we've advocated for affordable housing and the rezoning of your property. We've gotten to know you at protests in the community, and they all now recognize Greenwood Forest members at the grocery store." She said, "We knew that we had shared values, and this is a way that we could live out our values and ensure everyone has a place to live in our town by helping you with your project." They received a $150,000 gift from St. Paul's, or we received, a $150,000 gift from St. Paul's for our new child care center in the Carr Center that is in our bank. And the Caring Place received a $150,000 gift for their transitional housing apartments in the Carr Center. How did this happen? Because we've sat around in a circle together, looked at what we all have to offer, and brought all of our resources to the table. As we were ending the meeting, Stefan, the lead organizer for One Wake, looked around the circle of people who had gathered at the end of the meeting, and he said, "When you look around this room, what do you see?" People said various things like resources, privilege, diversity. And Stefan said, when I look around this room, I see power. And in that moment, Stefan reminded me of the many people, some of whom were in that room, many of whom are in this room, who've made the dream of the Carr Center possible. And when we face challenges and setbacks and roadblocks, and it all becomes too much, and it feels like maybe it isn't possible after all, we need to sit down together. We need to look at one another and ask God to bless the resources that we have so that what looks impossible becomes possible. We need to remember the power we have together as people who want a just world. When Reverend Robinson at Black Mountain Presbyterian Church opened her doors wide, she didn't even know if it was possible to meet the enormous need. And in just a few days, they were feeding 1,000 people a day. And soon the church was filled to the brim with donated food and clothing and supplies from all over. And a local restaurant became a partner and moved the feeding to their location, which was much larger. And a local business donated their 3,000 square foot warehouse for donated supplies. And over $2 million of donations were given to a hurricane relief fund the church created, and that money was distributed to local organizations and nonprofits to help with hurricane recovery efforts and affordable housing. And that first day, when Reverend Robinson was overwhelmed by the crowd of people and the dire need and the thought of having to wash dishes in water from a trash can, I don't know that she could have imagined the end of the story. And how so many things that seemed impossible became possible as their community worked together. So this morning, I can tell you something good. When we have the courage to truly get to know one another, we can be transformed from a crowd into a community that shares its resources. Jesus will take, break, and bless our resources, creating abundance in our world. And in God's economy, there is enough. There's more than enough. And in fact, there will always be 12 baskets of leftovers. When you are feeling overwhelmed and you've had enough of the evil and injustices of this world and you are in need of hearing something good, sit down together and look around. And when you look around this room, what do you see? I see resources, abundance, compassion, commitment, friends, advocates, and power. I see a people who are willing to sit down together with one another and make the impossible possible. I see a people who are willing to go and see and find a way to give all of God's beloved something to eat and to make our world a more just and loving place. Amen.